confession, written and read by Malcolm Cowper. October 1965. Dear Mother, as you know, I attended Uncle Cecil's funeral yesterday. I apologise for your absence, explaining that you were too unwell to attend. At the wake, I happened to be sitting within earshot of Uncle Arthur, who, as usual, was drunk, and I could not help overhearing him say something which shook me to the core. Of course, he said, Harry has no idea that Alice wasn't his real mother. Keep your voice down, dear, hissed Aunt Edith, glancing nervously at me. But it was too late. The cat was out of the bag. So, Mother, if that is what you are, an explanation, please. I know Uncle Arthur is an old windbag, but he's not a liar. So what did he mean, Alice is not their real mother? Your affectionate son, if that is what I am, Harry. October 1965. My dear Harry, I am so utterly devastated that this sad truth has reached you by a drunken loudmouth of an uncle. But the truth, I'm afraid it is. I am not your real mother. But if I tell you the truth, as I now must, I pray that you will forgive me for not having told you long ago the story I am now about to tell. Your father and I were childhood sweethearts, but as we reached maturity, our paths deviated, although we remained friends. He wanted to better himself and rise above his lowly status as a blacksmith's son. He took correspondence courses in accountancy and bookkeeping and obtained a good situation with a leading firm in town. Meanwhile, I became more and more politically aware and was drawn into the women's suffrage movement, not Mrs. Pankhurst's militant group, but the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, who campaigned through persuasion, lobbying MPs and holding rallies. Then, in 1910, your father announced that he had obtained a position as an accountant with a gold mining company in Bulawayo, southern Rhodesia, and he wanted me to go out with him. This would have meant getting married, but I was only 18 and passionately committed to the right of women to have votes. Yet I felt devastated when I waved him off at Southampton. In the course of my work, I became friendly with a young Welsh schoolmaster called Owen Griffiths. He was an active member of the Labour Party and supported the women's suffrage movement. As we got to know each other, it became obvious that he was in love with me, but although I liked him well enough, I did not feel the same towards him. In fact, I now realised that I was in love with your father. How I regretted not going out to Africa with him, but I still could not bring myself to do so. My campaigning work meant the world to me, and I enjoyed it immensely. Then, in 1914, your father wrote to say that he was getting married. I was devastated, for surely he was now beyond my reach. I wept bitterly, but it was too late, and I cursed my foolishness in not going with him. It was just at that time that Owen, who knew nothing of your father, proposed to me. I was, as we would say these days, on the rebound. Certainly, I was in no fit state to make such a momentous decision, and I accepted him. Maybe, in my confused state of mind, I saw it as an act of revenge for him marrying someone else. But I knew immediately after the ceremony that it had been a huge mistake. Too late, the deed was done, and I had a lifetime to live with my stupidity. In August of that year, the war broke out. All suffrage campaigning stopped, and women were urged to support the war effort. I trained as an auxiliary nurse, but Owen declared that he was a pacifist and refused to enlist. When in 1916 the government introduced conscription, he appealed before a tribunal as a conscientious objector, but was rejected. When he still refused to enlist, he was arrested, tried, and sent to Dartmoor. Also in 1916, I received a letter from your father to say that on the 22nd of November you had come into the world. This only added to my grief, for he was now irrevocably lost to me. The following year, I received an anonymous letter to say that Owen had escaped from prison along with 6 other conscientious objectors. Being men of some intelligence, they had found a weakness in the security system which enabled them to break out. Once outside the walls, they were spirited away to safe houses where they spent the rest of the war. I was not told where Owen was hiding for fear that the police might come and question me, though they never did. In 1918 came the news that women were to be given the vote. Well, women over 30 who owned property. I did not rejoice. We had fought for the right of all women to vote, not just a select few. But we were all too war-weary to continue the fight. And then, as if there had not been enough deaths already, the Spanish flu pandemic broke out. It would eventually claim more lives worldwide than the war itself. It would certainly change my life. It was just before Christmas 1918 that a letter arrived from your father. I expected it to contain seasonal greetings, but when I opened it, I almost fainted with shock. For what he said was that 6 weeks earlier, his wife had given birth to a second son, whom they called Kenneth, but just a fortnight later, she had been struck down by the pandemic. It seemed that women who had recently given birth were particularly vulnerable. He was now a widower with 2 very young sons, and he begged me to come out to Rhodesia and help him to look after them. Needless to say, he knew nothing of Owen. I was utterly at a loss to know what to do. On the one hand, here was a totally unexpected second chance to be with the man I now knew I loved. On the other hand, how could I desert a man who loved me, the man who had gone to prison in defence of his principles, and whom I had applauded for doing so? Besides, I could not just turn up and move in with your father. That would be totally unacceptable, especially in the very conservative society of Bulawayo. However, I was a married woman, and if I passed myself off as a war widow seeking employment, that would be just about pass for respectability. At that time, there were so many women desperately needing work to supplement their meagre pensions. Also, I was now totally disillusioned with the women's suffrage movement and the hollow victory it had achieved. So in the end, I decided, not without enormous pangs of guilt, that I would have to desert the man I didn't love for the man I did. I scraped together the fare, and after a journey of 6 weeks, I arrived in Bulawayo to start a new life. Your father was ecstatic that we were finally together. I took to you and Kenny immediately. You were then just turned 2 and seemed to have quite happily accepted the fact that Mummy had gone to live with God and that I was now looking after you. Kenny, of course, had no memory of her. We skillfully maintained the pretense that I was the nanny and housekeeper, and we continued as a happy family unit for the next 4 years. I tried repeatedly to contact Owen via his brother to ask for a divorce, but he refused to answer my letters. Oh well, I thought, he'll have to agree to a divorce sometime if he wants to remarry. And then, in 1923, came a devastating blow. Despite my precautions, I found myself pregnant. No longer could our pretense be maintained, so we decided that in the absence of any word from Owen, we would have to fake a marriage. We all went on holiday to Cape Town, where nobody would know us, and when we returned, we had become Mr. and Mrs. Collins. Except that no wedding had taken place, but our friends were not to know that. They swallowed our story that we had decided on impulse to get married. A few months later, your half-sister, Elizabeth was born, and 4 years later came Annette. So we were now a family of 6, and for the next 3 decades we led a comfortable life in southern Rhodesia. We had an anxious few years while you boys were serving in the RAF during the war, and were of course devastated when we heard that Kenny had been shot down, but thank God you came back alive. But as we came into the 60s, the winds of change were blowing through Africa, as Harold Macmillan said. Britain was starting to shed its colonies. We knew it was only a matter of time before our country became independent, and we decided to get out while the going was good. By then, you had already come back to Britain, of course, and the girls were not far behind. So now We are all back in the mother country and desperately missing the sun and wide open spaces of Africa. I never heard from Owen again, which means he must never have married. After one spell in prison, bigamy was presumably never an option for him. It was not until 3 years ago that his brother informed me he had died, and your father and I were finally able to get married. You may wonder why we bothered after 40 years of happily living together, but we decided it would make your inheritance easier if we were married. It was a pretty short marriage, it turned out, less than 2 years before your father sadly passed away. So there you have it, Harry. I so wanted to tell you the truth, but the time never seemed right. And I was so afraid that the beautiful relationship I had with you and Kenny would be irreparably damaged. I could not have loved you more had I given birth to you myself, and I hope you will know this when you pass judgment on me. I beg for your forgiveness. Your ever-loving Mother. October 22, 1965. My dear Mother, my only regret after reading your letter is that you did not tell me this a long time ago. Neither Kenny nor I had the slightest inkling that you are not my birth mother. You gave us all the love that any mother could have shown, and never showed favouritism to Lizzie and Netta because they were your own children. I am so grateful, now I know your story, that you had the courage to leave Owen and come out to Africa, and I understand what an agonizing decision that must have been for you. How different all our lives would have been had you not done so. So fear not, Mother, that in telling me the truth you have caused any damage to our relationship. If anything, it is stronger than ever, and I completely forgive you for keeping your story to yourself all those years. Your ever-loving son, Harry.